The airport hummed with the rhythm of early morning. The sound of rolling suitcases. Distant voices over the intercom announcing gate changes. And the soft patter of rain against the towering glass windows formed a backdrop both familiar and impersonal. Travelers moved with purpose, their faces set with a quiet determination. It was the kind of scene one could observe every day without truly seeing. Where humanity blended into a collective shuffle toward destinations unknown. At Gate 27, Ayla Monroe stood near the crew counter, calmly reviewing her flight plan. She wore her Navy captain's uniform with quiet pride, her polished shoes and neatly arranged hair speaking to the kind of precision that had guided her through years of rigorous training. This flight wasn't her first as captain, but it was among the first few, a significant milestone in a journey that had required her to walk paths fewer dared to tread. Ayla had no illusions about what her presence represented to some. She knew her face, and the stripes on her shoulders challenged long-held notions about what a pilot should look like. As a black woman in a field that was still overwhelmingly male and white, her every step onto an aircraft carried the weight of expectations, assumptions, and unspoken doubts. But this wasn't new. It had been a part of her life for as long as she could remember. And she had learned to meet it with the same calm professionalism she brought to the cockpit. Behind the counter, a gate agent scanned boarding passes for a steadily growing line of passengers. Among them was Lauren Spencer, a middle-aged woman with a perfectly styled blonde bob and a handbag that bore monogrammed initials in gold. Her cream-colored trench coat remained impeccably unwrinkled, even in the damp air, and her sharp heels clicked against the floor with every deliberate step. Lauren handed her ticket to the agent with a smile that seemed more rehearsed than genuine. As the scanner beeped, her eyes flicked to Ayla, who was speaking quietly with the flight attendant assigned to her crew. Ayla's uniform and confident stance caught Lauren's attention, though not in the way one might admire competence. Instead, her brow furrowed slightly, and her lips pressed into a faint line. "That's the pilot?" Lauren asked the gate agent, her voice low but pointed. The agent, momentarily caught off guard, glanced toward Ayla before answering. "Yes, ma'am, that's Captain Monroe. She'll be flying your plane today." Lauren's smile froze, then faded. She tilted her head, as though trying to reconcile the image of Ayla with what she expected to see. "Huh," she muttered, her tone carrying the weight of something unsaid. She adjusted the strap of her handbag and moved toward the boarding line, her heels clicking once again. Ayla noticed the glance. She had seen it many times before. The small, fleeting expressions that spoke volumes without saying a word. They were as much a part of her life as her pilot's cap and ID badge. She didn't react outwardly, keeping her attention on the flight attendant, who was recounting a last-minute change in the seating chart. Yet a small voice in her mind whispered its familiar refrain. "You're being judged again." Quietly, but judged nonetheless. The rain outside had intensified, streaking the windows with gray lines that blurred the view of the tarmac. Inside the terminal, passengers shuffled into the boarding bridge, many too preoccupied with their own concerns to notice anything out of the ordinary. But Lauren Spencer noticed. She paused just before stepping onto the aircraft, her hand resting on the cool metal of the bridge rail. Her eyes sought out Ayla again, who had moved to greet the passengers as they boarded. Ayla's voice was steady and welcoming. "Good morning. Welcome aboard Flight 947. Lauren stepped closer, hesitated, and then leaned toward a nearby flight attendant. "Excuse me," she said in a voice that carried both urgency and indignation. "Is she really the captain?" She nodded toward Ayla, her question dripping with incredulity. The flight attendant offered a polite but firm smile. "Yes, ma'am. Captain Monroe is one of our most experienced pilots. You're in excellent hands." Lauren's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing further. She boarded the plane, though her movements were deliberate, as if each step carried the weight of an unspoken protest. In her mind, the notion of excellent hands seemed far-fetched, almost ludicrous. As Ayla continued greeting passengers, her focus remained unbroken. She had learned long ago how to stand firm in the face of discomfort. How to hold herself with quiet authority even when doubt lingered in the air like a faint shadow. For her, the act of stepping onto a plane, of commanding the cockpit, was not just a job, it was a declaration. "I belong here. Lauren found her first-class seat and settled in with the precision of someone who had done so many times before. She smoothed the folds of her coat, arranged her belongings neatly in the seat pocket, and then glanced toward the aisle. As more passengers filed in, she noticed Ayla moving with purpose toward the cockpit. Her presence, poised, confident, and professional, seemed to unsettle Lauren in a way she couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't that Lauren doubted Ayla's qualifications outright. She knew the rigorous standards required of pilots. But something about seeing Ayla in that role, wearing that uniform, defied the image she had unconsciously held for years. It was an unease she wouldn't name, but it lingered nonetheless. As the plane filled, the cabin settled into the familiar quiet of pre-flight. Ayla's voice came over the intercom, calm and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Monroe speaking. Welcome aboard. We'll be departing shortly, and I'd like to thank you for choosing to fly with us today." Lauren shifted in her seat, her lips tightening. She didn't realize her fingers were gripping the armrests just a little too tightly. Across the aisle, a young mother adjusted her child's seatbelt and offered a quiet smile to Lauren. As if sensing the tension, Lauren didn't return the gesture. Outside, the rain showed no signs of stopping. The skies were gray and heavy, and the distant rumble of thunder hinted at turbulence ahead. But inside the cockpit, Ayla Monroe sat at the controls, her hands steady, her focus unwavering. For her, the storm outside was just another challenge to navigate a familiar terrain she had mastered long ago. As the engines roared to life and the plane began its slow taxi to the runway, Lauren glanced toward the cockpit door. She couldn't see Ayla anymore, but her presence loomed large in Lauren's thoughts. It was a quiet, unspoken tension. One that neither of them could escape. The gentle hum of the aircraft filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats, each engrossed in their own private world of magazines, devices, or idle conversation. First class was no exception. Here, where soft leather and wide legroom promised a premium experience, the air carried a subtle expectation of comfort, a space untouched by the more chaotic bustle of the economy cabin. Karen Spencer sat stiffly in her seat near the front of the cabin, her carefully curated beige ensemble still immaculate despite the frustration simmering beneath. Her eyes flitted toward the cockpit door, narrowing slightly. The sight of Captain Ayla Monroe greeting passengers earlier had not faded from her mind, the image replaying with the sharpness of an unanswered question. A black woman in command of this flight, no less. Was a reality Karen had not considered until today. And she wasn't sure she wanted to. She glanced at the flight attendant moving down the aisle, her voice low as she beckoned the young woman closer. "Excuse me," Karen began, her tone carrying the polite veneer of authority. "Can you tell me how long the captain has been flying?" The attendant paused, her smile unwavering but her eyes curious. "Captain Monroe? She's one of our best, highly experienced and well-trained. You're in excellent hands." Karen pursed her lips, the response neither confirming nor dispelling her unease. "I see," she replied, her voice clipped. "I've just never, well, let's just say I wasn't expecting someone like her to be in charge." The attendant's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Karen to notice. But it quickly returned. "Rest assured, ma'am," she said gently, "Captain Monroe is more than qualified. Please let me know if there's anything else I can assist you with." Karen nodded curtly, dismissing her with a wave of her manicured hand. The attendant moved on, her professional demeanor intact, but Karen remained unsettled. She had flown countless times, yet never under circumstances that felt quite so unusual. And though she could not, or would not articulate it fully, something about the situation gnawed at her, a vague discomfort she struggled to rationalize. Across the aisle, a young mother adjusted her son's seatbelt, her movements quick and practiced. The boy, no older than 6, swung his legs idly, his small sneakers brushing against the seat in front of him. Karen watched them with faint disapproval, her gaze lingering until the mother glanced up and caught her eye. Karen leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Do you know the captain is a woman?" she asked, her tone carrying a subtle note of incredulity. "And, well," Karen hesitated, letting the rest of her observation hang in the air. Unspoken but understood. The young mother blinked, taken aback. Yes, I saw her, she replied, her voice steady but cool. I think it's wonderful. My son was excited to see her. It's inspiring. Really? Karen's expression hardened, a faint flush creeping into her cheeks. Well, I suppose that's one way to look at it, she murmured, leaning back in her seat. Her discomfort grew, each passing moment amplifying her sense of unease. This flight was supposed to be uneventful, routine. Instead, it felt fraught with an undercurrent she could neither name nor escape. The intercom crackled to life, and the calm, measured voice of Captain Monroe filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're preparing for takeoff and expect a smooth journey. Though we may encounter some light turbulence along the way, please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and enjoy the flight. Karen stiffened at the sound, her hands gripping the armrests as the plane began to taxi down the runway. The young mother across the aisle smiled at her son, whispering something that made him giggle softly. Around them, passengers adjusted their belongings, their expressions calm and untroubled. Karen, however, could not share their ease. Her mind raced, fueled by doubts that had taken root and now refused to let go. As the plane lifted into the air, the gentle ascent contrasted with the weight of Karen's thoughts. Outside, clouds loomed on the horizon, their edges blurred against the fading light. Inside, the hum of the engines provided a steady rhythm, a sound that should have been reassuring. But for Karen, the flight felt anything but ordinary. It was as if the familiar order of things had been subtly, imperceptibly altered, leaving her untethered in a way she could neither explain nor accept. The turbulence, when it came, was mild, a few soft dips and shudders that caused drinks to tremble in their cups but left most passengers unfazed. Karen, however, clutched her armrests tightly, her knuckles pale against the dark leather. Her unease, already heightened, threatened to tip into something resembling panic. She turned to the flight attendant once more, her voice edged with urgency. Are you sure she knows what she's doing? Karen asked, her tone sharper than intended. This turbulence feels worse than it should be. The attendant, now familiar with Karen's anxieties, offered her a patient smile. Turbulence is perfectly normal, ma'am, especially in weather like this. Captain Monroe is monitoring everything closely. Karen shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. I'm just not convinced, she muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. A few glanced in her direction, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to thinly veiled annoyance. The young mother across the aisle caught Karen's eye, her tone soft but firm as she said, maybe we should give the captain the benefit of the doubt. She's trained for this. After all, Karen's gaze flickered toward her, a mix of irritation and disbelief flashing across her face. But she said nothing, turning instead toward the window. Outside, the clouds thickened, their dark masses rolling across the sky like a storm gathering strength. Karen's reflection stared back at her, faint and distorted against the glass. It was a face she scarcely recognized, tight with fear, shadowed by something she dared not name. The plane leveled out, and the turbulence eased, but the tension in Karen's chest remained, a stubborn knot that refused to loosen. Across the aisle, the young mother opened a picture book for her son, her voice low and soothing as she read aloud. Karen watched them out of the corner of her eye, the quiet intimacy of their interaction both comforting and disconcerting. It reminded her, uncomfortably, of something she had lost, or perhaps never fully possessed. As the cabin settled into an uneasy calm, Karen's thoughts churned. She could not shake the feeling that this flight, and this day, would leave her with more questions than answers. And though she could not yet see it, the storm brewing outside was nothing compared to the one that had already taken root within. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane cruised steadily at 35,000 feet. The murmur of conversation softened to a low hum, passengers settling into their routines, reading, dozing, or scrolling through their devices. Outside the window, the sky was a muted gray, heavy with clouds that hinted at intermittent turbulence. Inside, the atmosphere was calm, though a quiet tension simmered just beneath the surface for some. Karen sat rigid in her seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The faint vibration of the plane's engines seemed to amplify her discontent, each small jolt reminding her of her unease. Her gaze flicked repeatedly toward the cockpit door, an innocuous panel that now seemed imbued with an almost unbearable significance. It was a barrier not just to the pilots but to Karen's sense of control over her surroundings. The flight attendant reappeared in the aisle, her professional demeanor untouched by the weariness that had begun to show on some of the passengers' faces. Karen flagged her down with a deliberate wave, her movements precise and restrained. "I need to speak with someone in charge," Karen said, her tone low but firm. "This turbulence is unacceptable, and frankly, I'm not confident in the pilot's ability to handle it." The attendant hesitated, her practiced smile faltering for a moment before she responded. "Ma'am, I assure you, Captain Monroe is one of our most experienced pilots. She's navigating this turbulence with the utmost care." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "That may be what you're told to say, but I've flown enough to know when something feels off. I want to know how many years of experience she actually has." The flight attendant's expression remained polite, though a trace of weariness crept into her voice. "Captain Monroe has more than 10 years of flight experience. Ma'am, please rest assured that you're in capable hands." Karen didn't respond immediately, her gaze narrowing as she studied the attendant's face for signs of insincerity. Finding none, she leaned back slightly, but the tension in her posture remained. Her silence, however, carried an unspoken dissatisfaction, one that was not lost on the passengers seated nearby. Across the aisle, the young mother glanced up from her son's book, her brow furrowing slightly as she observed Karen. She had been listening, though not intentionally, and now found herself debating whether to speak. After a moment, she leaned forward, her tone gentle but firm. "You know," the mother began, addressing Karen directly, "it's really remarkable to have a captain like her. My son thought it was amazing to see a woman in charge." Karen turned toward her, her expression unreadable. "I suppose that's one way to look at it," she replied, her voice clipped. "But I'm more concerned about safety than symbolism." The mother held her gaze for a moment, her expression softening. "Safety is important," she said, "but don't you think someone like Captain Monroe has had to work twice as hard to be where she is? If anything, that makes me trust her even more." Karen didn't respond immediately, her face tightening as if the comment had struck a nerve. She looked away, her eyes returning to the window. The conversation seemed over, but the silence that followed felt weighted, charged with unspoken tensions that lingered in the space between them. A sudden jolt of turbulence shook the cabin, causing several passengers to grip their armrests reflexively. The fastened seatbelt sign illuminated with a soft ding, and a voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Monroe speaking. We're experiencing some moderate turbulence as we pass through this weather system. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We appreciate your cooperation and expect smoother skies ahead." The calm professionalism in Ayla's voice seemed to reassure most of the passengers. A few exchanged glances, their expressions relaxed, but Karen's reaction was different. Her fingers dug into the armrests, her jaw tightening as she muttered under her breath, her words barely audible but charged with frustration. "This is what happens when standards are compromised," she said, her voice just loud enough for the passengers nearby to hear. A middle-aged man seated a few rows ahead turned slightly, casting her a disapproving glance before returning to his book. The turbulence continued for a few moments before subsiding. The cabin settled back into a quiet rhythm, but Karen's agitation remained. She called the flight attendant again, her tone sharper this time. "Why didn't the captain avoid this turbulence?" she demanded. "Surely, someone with her experience could have taken a better route." The attendant's patience was beginning to wear thin, though she maintained her professionalism. "Ma'am, turbulence is a natural part of flying and can't always be avoided. Captain Monroe is monitoring the situation closely to ensure a safe and comfortable flight." Karen shook her head, her frustration bubbling over. "Comfortable? I wouldn't call this comfortable. I've never experienced turbulence like this before. Capable captain." The attendant paused, her lips pressing together in a measured response. "Ma'am, I understand your concerns, but I must ask that you remain calm and respectful. The captain and crew are doing everything possible to ensure a safe flight. Karen scoffed, her voice rising slightly. Respectful? I have every right to question the competence of the person flying this plane. If something happens, I want it on record that I raise these concerns. Her words hung in the air, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. A man seated a row behind Karen leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet but firm. Ma'am, maybe you should let the crew do their job. You're not helping anyone by making a scene. Karen whipped her head around to glare at him, her expression indignant. Excuse me? I'm simply voicing legitimate concerns. If you're comfortable putting your life in someone else's hands without question, that's your choice. The man sighed, leaning back in his seat. Across the aisle, the young mother turned to her son, gently reminding him to focus on his book. Karen caught her eye and frowned, her irritation deepening. The flight attendant, sensing the growing unrest, stepped closer. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. Passengers are becoming uncomfortable. Karen glared at her, her voice trembling with restrained anger. Uncomfortable? You think I'm the problem here? Maybe if this airline had better standards, none of us would be in this situation. The attendant remained calm, though her tone grew firmer. Ma'am, this is your final warning. If you continue to disrupt the flight, we'll have no choice but to report your behavior. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but another jolt of turbulence interrupted her. The plane rocked slightly, and a collective gasp rippled through the cabin. For a moment, even Karen was silent, her fingers gripping the armrests as she stared at the cockpit door. In the midst of the chaos, the intercom crackled to life once more. Captain Monroe's voice, steady and composed, cut through the tension. Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered a brief patch of stronger turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We appreciate your patience as we navigate through this. Karen's face hardened, her eyes narrowing as she muttered under her breath, her voice low but filled with disdain. Patience. That's easy for her to say. Nearby passengers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of discomfort and quiet frustration. The young mother glanced at Karen again, her voice soft but resolute. Sometimes, she said quietly, you just have to trust that the people in charge know what they're doing. Karen didn't respond, her gaze fixed firmly on the cockpit door. But her silence spoke volumes. A tension that rippled outward, unsettling the fragile calm of the cabin. As the turbulence eased and the plane steadied, the atmosphere remained charged, the unspoken conflicts simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for a resolution that seemed farther away with each passing moment. The plane touched down with a gentle thud, the vibrations rippling through the cabin as passengers stirred from their travel-induced stupor. A few exchanged polite smiles, already retrieving their belongings from the overhead compartments as the fastened seatbelt sign blinked off. The storm outside had finally subsided, leaving behind only a misty drizzle streaking the windows of the aircraft. Karen remained in her seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her posture was stiff, her lips pressed into a thin line. The past few hours had felt interminable, each moment amplifying the discomfort she had tried and failed to conceal. Around her, other passengers moved with practiced ease, their conversations light and inconsequential. To Karen, it felt like a betrayal. How could they be so calm, so accepting, after everything that had transpired? In the cockpit, Captain Ayla Monroe and her co-pilot, Daniel Pierce, exchanged quiet words as they finalized their post-flight procedures. For Ayla, the routine was second nature, each step a grounding ritual that steadied her thoughts. She had felt the weight of Karen's judgment throughout the flight, not through direct interaction, but in the subtle, pervasive tension that seemed to radiate from the cabin. It was not the first time, nor would it be the last, that her presence as a black female pilot drew scrutiny. Yet, today's confrontation had left a deeper mark than she cared to admit. You did great, Daniel said, his voice low but warm. He glanced at her with quiet admiration. Turbulence or not, you handled that perfectly. Ayla gave a small, appreciative nod, her focus still on the controls. Thanks, Dan, she replied. It's just another day in the skies, right? He hesitated, sensing the weight behind her words. Not every pilot could keep their composure like you did today. That's something to be proud of. Ayla met his gaze briefly. A flicker of gratitude passing between them. She knew he meant well. But pride wasn't the emotion sitting heavy in her chest. Resilience. Perhaps. Exhaustion. Certainly. But pride? That was harder to summon when the journey to this seat, this responsibility, was so often met with doubt. Back in the cabin, the flight attendants moved with calm efficiency, guiding passengers toward the exit. Karen watched them silently, her face betraying none of the simmering frustration that had consumed her earlier. As one attendant approached, Karen's voice broke through the gentle hum of movement. "I'd like to speak with someone about what happened today," she said, her tone sharp but controlled. The turbulence was unacceptable, and frankly, so was the lack of professionalism. The attendant, a young woman with steady eyes, paused. "Of course, ma'am," she said politely. "You're welcome to share your concerns with customer service once we've disembarked." Karen bristled at the response, sensing a dismissal in the woman's measured tone. "I'd prefer to speak to someone now," she insisted. The attendant hesitated, clearly weighing her options. "I'll inform the captain of your concerns," she said finally, her voice calm. "In the meantime, please remain seated until the other passengers have exited." Karen leaned back in her seat, unsatisfied but temporarily silenced. Around her, passengers began filing out, their movements a blur of quiet efficiency. A young mother passed by, her son clutching her hand. The boy glanced at Karen with wide, curious eyes, but his mother gently urged him forward, her own gaze carefully averted. As the last passenger left, Karen stood abruptly, her movements stiff with indignation. She turned toward the cockpit door just as it opened, revealing Captain Monroe and Daniel stepping out. Ayla's presence was calm and steady, her uniform still crisp despite the long flight. She met Karen's gaze with a quiet strength that seemed to root her in place. "Captain Monroe," Karen began, her voice clipped, "I need to address some serious concerns about this flight." Ayla's expression remained neutral, through her eyes held a quiet resolve. "Of course," she said, her tone even. "I'm happy to listen to your concerns." "Ma'am." Karen hesitated, the words she had rehearsed in her mind faltering under the weight of Ayla's composure. For a moment, the cabin seemed unnaturally quiet, the hum of the engines fading into the background. The turbulence was mishandled, Karen said finally, her voice less steady than she intended. "And, frankly, I've never felt less confident in a pilot's abilities." Ayla regarded her silently for a moment, her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her voice was calm but firm. "I understand that turbulence can be unsettling, but I can assure you that every decision I made was for the safety of this flight and its passengers." Karen's lips parted, as if to argue, but Ayla continued, her tone unwavering. "As a captain, my priority is ensuring a safe journey for everyone on board. I take that responsibility very seriously." Karen's gaze faltered, her confidence slipping under Ayla's steady presence. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, two airport security personnel stepped into the cabin, their expressions neutral but authoritative. "Ma'am," one of them said, addressing Karen directly, "we need to speak with you about an incident during the flight." Karen stiffened, her eyes darting between the security officers and Ayla. "Incident?" she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "What are you talking about?" The officer remained calm. "We've received reports of a disruption involving a member of the crew. We'd like to discuss this further in a private setting." Karen's face flushed, a mixture of indignation and disbelief washing over her. "This is absurd," she snapped. "I was simply voicing legitimate concerns about this flight." Ayla stepped back, allowing the officers to handle the situation. Her presence remained composed, but there was a faint tension in her posture, a reminder of the fine line she had walked throughout the flight, balancing professionalism against the burden of expectations. As Karen was escorted off the plane, the cabin felt quieter than ever. Ayla watched her go, the weight of the moment settling heavily on her shoulders. She knew that Karen's actions would have repercussions, not just for herself but for the broader, unspoken tensions that had defined their interaction. Later, as Ayla exited the plane, she was met by several members of the airline's ground staff. Their expressions were warm, their words of support a quiet balm to the day's events. "You handled that beautifully," one of them said, offering her a reassuring smile. "It's not easy, but you did exactly what was needed." Ayla nodded, her gratitude genuine but subdued. As she made her way through the terminal, her thoughts lingered on the flight, on Karen, and on the quiet resilience it took to navigate moments like these. She knew there would be more flights, more challenges, more days when the weight of her role felt heavier than the skies she loved to navigate. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of reflection, a quiet reminder that every act of grace, no matter how small, was a step towards something larger, a future where the turbulence of prejudice might one day give way to clearer skies. In the days following the flight, the story spread quietly but persistently. Like ripples on a still pond, passengers had filmed portions of Karen's outburst, the recordings capturing her sharp tone and the calm professionalism of Captain Monroe. By the time the plane reached the gate, snippets of the incident were already circulating online, drawing attention far beyond the airport. Ayla Monroe, however, remained unaware of the growing storm. Her focus was on the routine of her work, the steady rhythm of pre-flight checklists and the hum of jet engines grounding her amidst the echoes of Karen's remarks. She had long learned that such experiences, though jarring, were part of the unspoken reality of her role. Yet this time, the memory of Karen's pointed words lingered longer than usual, sharp and unyielding in their quiet insistence. For Karen, the fallout was immediate and jarring. Her tirade, captured on multiple phones, had become a viral moment. Strangers dissected her words, her tone, and even her body language, labeling her as a symbol of entitlement and prejudice. Comments flooded social media, ranging from outright condemnation to uncomfortable questions about the subtle ways bias shaped daily interactions. At first, Karen tried to ignore the attention, convincing herself it would fade as quickly as it had arrived. But the emails and calls from her employer painted a different picture. Her company, citing the values it claimed to uphold, placed her on indefinite leave pending an internal review. Friends and family reached out less frequently, their words tinged with a cautious distance, as though unsure of how to navigate the spotlight she had brought upon herself. Karen sat alone in her apartment one evening, the silence pressing against her like a weight. On her phone, she scrolled through the messages flooding her inbox, pausing at a sharply worded text from her sister. "Karen, what were you thinking? This isn't just about you anymore." She stared at the screen, her mind circling back to the same question she had asked herself since stepping off the plane. How had it come to this? Across town, Ayla received a different kind of attention. Her airline had quietly shared its support for her handling of the situation, and colleagues reached out with messages of encouragement. Many expressed admiration for the way she had maintained her composure under such visible scrutiny. In the quiet of her apartment, Ayla sifted through the emails and texts, pausing on one from a fellow pilot, a woman she had mentored years earlier. The message was simple but heartfelt. "Thank you for showing us how to rise above. You inspire more people than you know." Ayla's lips curved into a faint smile as she set her phone aside. These moments, small and fleeting, reminded her why she had chosen this path despite its challenges. Still, the day's events lingered in her mind, raising familiar questions about the quiet persistence of bias and the toll it exacted on those who bore its weight. In the days that followed, both women found themselves navigating unfamiliar territory. Karen, no longer insulated by her comfortable routines, was forced to confront the quiet isolation that came with public censure. Ayla, on the other hand, was drawn into a broader conversation about representation and resilience, her story resonating with those who saw themselves reflected in her journey. At a nearby community center, a group of young women gathered for an aviation workshop Ayla had agreed to lead months earlier. The room buzzed with quiet excitement as she walked in, her uniform a tangible symbol of what was possible. One of the attendees, a high school junior with wide, curious eyes, raised her hand hesitantly. "Captain Monroe," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Was it hard to become a pilot? I mean, did people ever doubt you?" Ayla paused, considering the question carefully. "It wasn't always easy," she admitted, her voice calm and steady. There were moments when I felt like I had to prove myself twice over just to be seen as equal. But I've learned that perseverance isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving to yourself that you belong. No matter what others might think. The young woman nodded, her expression thoughtful. Around her, the other attendees leaned in, drawn to the quiet strength in Ayla's words. For them, she was more than a pilot. She was a reminder that boundaries could be redefined, even in the face of resistance. Meanwhile, Karen's days took on a muted rhythm. The spotlight she had inadvertently stepped into began to fade, but its shadows lingered, casting a quiet pall over her once orderly life. At the urging of her employer, she reluctantly enrolled in a sensitivity training course, a requirement for any hope of returning to her previous role. The sessions, held in a modest community space, were a far cry from the polished boardrooms Karen was accustomed to. The facilitator, a soft-spoken man with decades of experience in conflict resolution, began each session with the same quiet prompt. Let's talk about the stories we carry. And the ones we don't realize we're telling. At first, Karen resisted, her defenses sharp and reflexive. She spoke in measured tones, framing her actions as the result of stress and poor communication. But as the sessions progressed, she found herself listening more than speaking. The stories of others drawing out the edges of her own blind spots. One evening, as the group discussed unconscious bias, Karen found herself thinking about Ayla. Her steady presence, her calm voice over the intercom, and the quiet resolve that had seemed so effortless. The memory was uncomfortable, not because of Ayla's actions, but because of Karen's. Later, as she walked home in the fading light, Karen replayed the words of a fellow attendee. Sometimes, the hardest thing to admit is that we didn't see the whole picture. For both women, the events of that day had become something larger than themselves. Ayla's quiet strength continued to ripple outward, inspiring those who saw in her a reflection of their own struggles and aspirations. Karen, meanwhile, began the slow, unsteady process of reckoning with the biases she had long ignored. Their paths, though unlikely to cross again, remained tethered by the shared experience of that flight. And while the journey toward understanding was far from over, the winds of change, though subtle, had begun to stir. Karen sat on the edge of a folding chair in the community center's meeting room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The room was simple, its walls adorned with motivational posters and community announcements, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. Around her, a small group of people sat in a loose circle, their expressions a mix of weariness and quiet introspection. The facilitator began the session in his usual unhurried tone, inviting participants to share their thoughts on the week's topic, accountability and growth. Karen hesitated, her gaze fixed on the gray carpet. For weeks, she had attended these sessions, listening as others spoke of their mistakes and the lessons they had taken from them. Each story chipped away at her defenses, forcing her to confront the part of herself she had worked so hard to rationalize. But speaking aloud felt different. It required an honesty she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Finally, the facilitator turned to her, his expression gentle but expectant. Karen, he said, his voice steady, would you like to share anything today? She took a breath, the silence in the room stretching around her like a weight. I don't know where to start, she admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. It's hard to put into words what I've been feeling. The facilitator nodded, his expression unchanged. Take your time, sometimes just starting is enough. Karen looked up, her gaze meeting him briefly before shifting to the window. The evening light streamed through the glass, soft and forgiving. I didn't think I was the problem, she said slowly. I thought I was justified, concerned about safety. About the standards I thought should be upheld. But now, looking back, her voice trailed off, a faint tremor beneath her words. Another participant, an older woman with kind eyes, leaned forward slightly. It's hard to see ourselves clearly at the moment, she said gently, but recognizing it now means you're starting to see the bigger picture. Karen nodded, her throat tightening. The bigger picture. It was a phrase that had been repeated often in these sessions. Yet it felt heavier each time she heard it. The truth was unavoidable. She had judged Ayla Monroe not on her abilities, but on her own discomfort with what Ayla represented. That realization, though painful, had begun to unravel the tightly woven assumptions Karen had carried for so long. Miles away, Ayla stood in the dim light of an airport conference room, her uniform pristine and her posture composed. She was addressing a group of aspiring pilots, many of them women and people of color who had come to hear her speak. The room buzzed with quiet energy, their anticipation palpable. Breaking barriers isn't glamorous, Ayla said, her voice calm but firm. It's hard work, it's lonely at times, and it means facing doubts. Not just from others, but sometimes from yourself. She paused, scanning the room. But it's worth it, not because it changes people's minds overnight, but because it shows the next generation that they don't have to wait for permission to follow their dreams. The audience listened intently, their faces a mix of admiration and determination. A young man in the front row raised his hand, his voice hesitant but earnest. How do you deal with people who don't think you belong? Ayla smiled faintly, her eyes softening. I remind myself that I'm here because I've earned it, and I don't let their doubts become mine. It's not easy, but it's necessary, because if I step back, if I give in, I'm not just letting them win, I'm making it harder for the person who comes after me. Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply with those who had faced similar struggles. For Ayla, moments like these were both a responsibility and a privilege, a chance to use her experience to light the path for others. Karen, meanwhile, had begun taking small but deliberate steps to rebuild her sense of purpose. Volunteering at the community center had become a part of her routine, offering a quiet solace she hadn't expected. One afternoon, as she sorted donations, she noticed a young girl lingering nearby, her gaze fixed on a stack of books. Looking for something? Karen asked gently, her voice soft. The girl nodded, her eyes bright with curiosity. I like reading about planes, she said shyly. I want to be a pilot someday. Karen felt a pang of recognition, the girl's quiet determination reminding her of the very person she had tried to diminish. That's a wonderful goal, she said, her tone genuine. You know, there are people out there who started just like you. And they've done amazing things. The girl's face lit up. Like Captain Monroe? She asked, her voice filled with admiration. She's my hero. Karen's breath caught, the name landing heavily in the quiet room. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. Yes, she said finally, her voice steady, exactly like her. As Karen's days at the community center stretched into weeks, she began to find a quiet rhythm in her work. She spoke less and listened more, her actions guided by a growing awareness of the role she wanted to play in shaping the world around her. The lessons she had learned through hard-earned became a foundation for the small acts of kindness and understanding she now sought to offer. For Ayla, life continued at its steady pace. Her career flourished, her name becoming synonymous with resilience and professionalism. She received letters from young women inspired by her journey, each one a reminder of the impact she was making. Yet, even as her influence grew, she remained grounded, her focus always on the work itself. Their paths, though different, reflected the quiet complexity of change. For Karen, it was a slow unraveling of old beliefs, replaced by a cautious hope for redemption. For Ayla, it was a steady ascent, each milestone a testament to the strength it took to rise above. And though they might never meet again, the echoes of their encounter lingered, a subtle reminder of the ways lives intertwine, even in conflict. And the possibilities that arise when growth takes root. However quietly, in the spaces left behind, the morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the airport lounge, its warm light casting a golden glow over the busy terminal. Captain Ayla Monroe sat quietly at a corner table, a steaming cup of coffee cradled in her hands. She wore her uniform with ease, its sharp lines and crisp insignia a testament to years of training and perseverance. Around her, the hum of conversations and the distant announcement of boarding calls blended into a comforting backdrop. Ayla was between flights, enjoying a rare moment of stillness. She had just returned from a speaking engagement at a local university, where she had shared her journey with a room full of aspiring pilots. The questions they had asked stayed with her. How do you stay strong when people doubt you? Did you ever feel like giving up? Her answers had been honest but measured. Yes, the doubts were real, both external and internal. And yes, there were moments when giving up seemed easier. But her strength, she had told them, came from a simple truth: she belonged in the skies. No matter who questioned it. As Ayla sipped her coffee, her phone buzzed softly on the table. It was a message from a young girl she had been mentoring. Maya, I passed my first flight exam. Thank you for believing in me. Captain Monroe. Ayla smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. She typed a quick reply, offering her congratulations and a reminder to keep pushing forward. These small connections, she knew, were among the most meaningful parts of her work. They were a quiet affirmation that the barriers she had faced and overcome were paving the way for others to follow. Karen Spencer, meanwhile, was navigating her own quiet transformation. She still attended the sensitivity training sessions, though the defensiveness she had clung to in the beginning had softened. The sessions were not easy. They forced her to confront truths about herself that she had spent years ignoring. One evening, as the group discussed implicit bias, Karen found herself thinking back to that flight, specifically to Ayla. She remembered the calm confidence in Ayla's voice as she addressed the passengers. The steadiness with which she had handled Karen's pointed complaints. It struck her, now, how much restraint that must have required. I didn't think I was being unfair, Karen admitted aloud, her voice hesitant. I thought I was being cautious. But looking back, I see now that my caution wasn't about safety. It was about my own assumptions, ones I didn't even realize I had. The facilitator nodded, his expression encouraging. Recognizing that as an important step, he said, the next question is, what will you do with that understanding? Karen sat back in her chair, the weight of his words settling over her. What would she do? Weeks later, Ayla was invited to deliver a keynote speech at an international aviation conference. The event, held in a sleek convention center, brought together industry leaders, pilots, and aspiring aviators from around the world. Ayla had spoken at events before, but this one felt different. It was larger, more formal, and the spotlight on her seemed brighter than ever. As she stood backstage, reviewing her notes, Ayla took a steadying breath. She thought of the many young faces she had met in classrooms, workshops, and community events, faces full of hope and determination. This speech wasn't just about her story, it was about theirs. When her name was announced, the room erupted in applause. Ayla stepped onto the stage, her stride confident but unhurried. She stood at the podium, the lights warm against her face, and scanned the sea of attentive faces before her. Good afternoon, she began, her voice steady. It's an honor to stand before you today. Not just as a pilot, but as someone who has had the privilege of navigating both the challenges and triumphs of breaking barriers in aviation. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. When I first started this journey, I didn't know what to expect. I only knew that I loved to fly. What I didn't realize was how often I'd have to prove that I deserved to be in the cockpit. And not just to others, but to myself. Her voice softened, though it carried easily through the quiet room. But what I've learned, what I hope to share with you today. Is that resilience isn't about being unshakable. It's about showing up, even when the doubts creep in. It's about believing in your abilities, even when others don't. The audience remained rapt, her words resonating deeply. Ayla spoke not just of her struggles, but of the importance of community, of mentors who had guided her, colleagues who had supported her, and the next generation who would build on the progress she had fought for. When we support one another, she concluded, we rise together, and in doing so, we create a future where no one has to prove they belong simply because of who they are. The applause was thunderous, and Ayla allowed herself a small, grateful smile. She left the stage feeling lighter, knowing her words had reached those who needed them most. Karen's path, though quieter, continued to unfold in unexpected ways. She had started volunteering regularly at the community center, mentoring young girls with dreams of aviation. It was a small gesture, but one that felt meaningful. One afternoon, as Karen packed up supplies after a workshop, a girl approached her with a hesitant smile. Ms. Spencer, She said softly. Do you think I could really be a pilot? Like Captain Monroe? Karen's chest tightened at the mention of Ayla's name. For a moment, she was transported back to that flight. To the choices she had made and the woman she had judged so unfairly. But she pushed the memory aside, focusing on the girl in front of her. I think you can be anything you want, Karen said, her voice steady. And if flying is your dream, don't let anyone, or anything, stand in your way. The girl beamed, her excitement contagious. Karen watched her leave, a faint sense of hope stirring in her chest. Perhaps this was how change began. Not with grand gestures, but with small, quiet steps towards something better. Though Ayla and Karen's lives now moved on parallel tracks, the thread that connected them remained. For Ayla, it was a reminder of the strength it took to rise above. For Karen, it was a lesson in humility and growth, a quiet reckoning with the biases she had carried and the choices she now had the chance to make differently. And though their paths were unlikely to cross again, both women continued forward, their journeys shaped by the turbulence they had weathered and the skies they now navigated with quiet resolve. The years softened the edges of the incident aboard Flight 294, turning it into something quieter, more reflective, a ripple in the lives of those involved, rather than the storm it once was. For Captain Ayla Monroe, the moment had long ceased to define her. It was now a memory, one of many in a career marked by triumphs and challenges, all tied to the skies she loved. She sat in her modest home one evening, sunlight streaming through the window, warming the wooden floors beneath her feet. On the coffee table lay a stack of letters, handwritten and heartfelt. Over time, these messages had become a part of her life. Notes from strangers who had seen her story, students inspired to pursue aviation, and colleagues who thanked her for her resilience. Ayla picked up one envelope from the stack, its return address unfamiliar. The letter began simply, Captain Monroe, I don't know if you'll read this, but I hope you will. My name is Karen Spencer. We met once, though not under the best circumstances. Ayla's eyes lingered on the words. She remembered Karen's face, tight with judgment, then flushed with anger. As clearly as she remembered the turbulence they had navigated that day. She continued reading, her expression calm, unreadable. I've thought about that day more times than I can count. I've replayed every word I said, every assumption I made. For a long time, I told myself I was justified. But the truth is, I was wrong. I judged you unfairly, and for that, I am deeply sorry. The letter went on, Karen recounting her journey through sensitivity training and her volunteer work with aspiring pilots. There was no attempt to excuse her behavior, only an acknowledgement of the harm she had caused and the growth she was still working toward. I've learned that an apology can't undo what's been done, but it's a start. I hope, in time, you can accept mine. Ayla set the letter down, her gaze shifting to the window. The street outside was quiet, the fading light casting long shadows across the pavement. She felt no anger, no lingering resentment. Instead, there was a sense of clarity, as if Karen's words had closed a door she hadn't realized was still ajar. She chose not to respond, not out of spite, but because she understood that Karen's journey was hers alone to navigate. Ayla had found her peace long ago, and she hoped Karen would, too. Karen, for her part, waited for a reply she suspected would never come. The act of writing the letter had been cathartic, a way to confront the person she had been and the person she hoped to become. She no longer sought validation, only a quiet sense of purpose in the life she was rebuilding. Her work at the community center became a cornerstone of that purpose. She spent hours mentoring young girls who dreamed of flying, helping them navigate the barriers that once felt insurmountable to her. For Karen, each conversation was a small act of atonement, a chance to plant seeds of hope where there had once been doubt. One afternoon, as she helped a young girl with a model airplane kit, the girl looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. Do you think I'll ever fly a real plane? Karen smiled, the question striking a chord deep within her. I know you will, she said softly. You just have to keep believing in yourself. And never let anyone tell you otherwise. Ayla's career continued to soar. She became a sought-after speaker at aviation conferences, her presence a quiet but powerful reminder of what resilience could achieve. Her words carried weight not because of their volume, but because of their authenticity. At one such conference, Ayla concluded her keynote address with a message that had become central to her journey. The skies don't care who you are, where you come from, or what others think of you. All that matters is your ability to navigate them with skill and integrity. That's the lesson I've carried with me. And the one I hope you carry forward. The applause that followed was warm and genuine, but Ayla accepted it with her characteristic humility. For her, the accolades were secondary to the work itself. The flights she piloted, the students she mentored, the quiet moments of progress that could never be measured in applause. One quiet evening, Ayla found herself at an airport terminal, waiting for a connecting flight. She watched the steady flow of travelers moving through the concourse, their expressions a mix of anticipation and fatigue. A young girl caught her eye, her small hands clutching a toy plane as she gazed out the window at the aircraft lined up on the tarmac. Ayla approached, her uniform catching the girl's attention. "Do you like airplanes?" she asked gently. The girl nodded enthusiastically, her eyes lighting up. "I want to be a pilot someday," she said, her voice filled with wonder. Ayla smiled. Reaching into her bag, she pulled out a small pin with her airline's logo, its silver surface gleaming in the terminal lights. "Here," she said, handing it to the girl. "This is for you. A little reminder that you can do anything you set your mind to." The girl's face lit up as she clutched the pin tightly. "Thank you," she exclaimed, her excitement contagious. As Ayla walked away, she felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the girl's dreams were now just a little closer to the horizon. Karen and Ayla's lives remained separate, their paths unlikely to cross again. Yet the lessons they had learned, about judgment, resilience, and the quiet power of change remained with them. For Ayla, each flight was a testament to the barriers she had overcome and the skies she had claimed as her own. For Karen, each act of service was a step toward redemption, a reminder that change, though slow, was possible, and though their journeys were different, they shared a common truth, that growth often comes not in sweeping gestures, but in the quiet, deliberate moments when we choose to rise above